Officer Jackson Manning stood over the young black man with handcuffs gleaming in the afternoon sun, his voice cutting through the courthouse steps like a blade designed to humiliate. "You think you're above the law because you're dressed nice," he sneered, tightening the metal around 23-year-old Luke Thornton's wrists, while a small crowd of courthouse visitors stopped to watch. Luke said nothing, his jaw set with the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from being raised by someone who understands both justice and patience. What Officer Manning didn't know, what he couldn't have known, as he shoved Luke toward his patrol car while courthouse security cameras captured every second, was that in exactly 47 minutes, he would be standing in courtroom 3B facing a misconduct hearing, and the man in the black robes who would decide his fate, the man whose gavel would determine whether Jackson Manning kept his badge or lost everything, was Judge William Thornton, Luke's father. "Which state are you from? Have you ever watched someone abuse their power right in front of a building dedicated to justice? What would you do if you saw this happening to someone you cared about?" The marble steps of the Riverside County Courthouse had witnessed thousands of moments like this. Not arrests, but arrivals. Lawyers climbing toward justice. Families seeking resolution. Citizens believing in a system that promised equality under law. These steps had been consecrated by hope, worn smooth by the footsteps of those who still believed that truth mattered more than the color of someone's skin. But today, those same steps were being desecrated by something uglier than crime, the casual cruelty of unchecked authority. Luke Thornton had been walking up those steps when Manning spotted him. Not running, not hiding, not doing anything except existing, while black and well-dressed on a Tuesday afternoon. His navy blue suit was pressed, his burgundy tie straight, his leather briefcase professional. He looked exactly like what he was, a recent law school graduate, heading to a scheduled appointment with a public defender's office about a potential internship. But to Jackson Manning, a 17-year veteran of the force with dead eyes and a badge that had become his license to inflict pain, Luke looked like something else entirely. "Hold up there, son," Manning had called out, his voice carrying the kind of false authority that men use when they know they're wrong but have the power to be wrong anyway. Luke had stopped, turned, his expression open and cooperative, because his father had taught him that respect was a two-way street. You give it first, then demand it in return. "Is there a problem, officer?" Luke had asked, his voice steady and clear, educated without being pretentious, respectful without being subservient. The kind of voice that should have de-escalated any reasonable situation. But Jackson Manning wasn't reasonable. He was something worse. A man who had spent 17 years learning that his badge could transform his personal failures into other people's problems. Manning approached slowly, his hand resting on his service weapon, not because he felt threatened, but because he wanted Luke to see it. The threat was the point. Problem. Manning had laughed, but there was no humor in it. Only the bitter satisfaction of a man about to prove that respect was something you could steal if you couldn't earn it. "Yeah, I got a problem. I got a problem with suspicious individuals loitering around government buildings." Luke had glanced around, genuinely confused. The courthouse steps were public space, busy with foot traffic. A woman in a business suit was talking on her phone, 20 feet away. An elderly man was reading a newspaper on a bench. A group of what appeared to be law students were discussing something in animated whispers. If this was loitering, then half the city was guilty. "I'm not loitering, sir," Luke had said, maintaining eye contact, but keeping his voice calm. "I have an appointment inside the building. I can show you the email confirmation if that would help." That's when Manning's eyes had hardened. The offer of proof, the reasonable tone, the lack of fear, it all infuriated him. Luke wasn't playing the role Manning had scripted in his head. He wasn't cowering, wasn't stammering, wasn't giving Manning the satisfaction of watching a young black man crumble under the weight of manufactured authority. "Don't you tell me what you can and can't do," Manning had snarled, stepping closer. "I decide what's suspicious around here. I decide who belongs and who doesn't. And right now, I'm deciding you don't belong." That's when the handcuffs had come out. The crowd that gathered wasn't large, but it was diverse. Courthouse employees taking smoke breaks, lawyers heading to afternoon hearings, citizens with business inside. They watched with the kind of horrified fascination that comes when you witness something that violates every principle a building is supposed to represent. Some pulled out phones, recording. Others whispered to each other, their voices tight with recognition that this wasn't law enforcement. This was something else wearing a law enforcement costume. "Sir, what am I being arrested for?" Luke had asked, as Manning grabbed his wrist with unnecessary force. The question was legitimate, protected by law, guaranteed by the Constitution. Manning's response was to twist the handcuff tighter than necessary. "Disorderly conduct," Manning had said, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Failure to comply with a lawful order. Public disturbance." Luke had done none of those things, and everyone watching knew it. But Jackson Manning had learned long ago that reality was negotiable when you had a badge, especially when your word was being weighed against that of a young black man who had committed the crime of existing with dignity in a space where Manning felt he didn't belong. "I was complying," Luke had said quietly, his voice carrying despite his restraint. "I answered your questions. I offered to show identification. I explained why I was here." "Shut up," Manning had snapped, grabbing Luke's other wrist and securing the second handcuff. The metal clicked with the sound of a trap closing, each click echoing off the marble steps like a countdown to justice's failure. But Luke wasn't just any young black man being processed through Manning's personal vendetta machine. He was the son of Judge William Thornton, a man who had spent 23 years on the bench, earning a reputation for fairness, wisdom, and an unshakable commitment to constitutional law. Luke had grown up in courtrooms, had learned to read judicial temperament before he could ride a bicycle, had absorbed the principles of due process and equal protection through dinner table conversations and bedtime stories about justice prevailing over prejudice. Manning pressed his knee into Luke's back as he guided him down the steps, applying pressure that was unnecessary and punitive. The young man's professional appearance, the suit that had taken him months to save for, the briefcase that contained his law school transcripts and letters of recommendation, was being systematically degraded with each rough gesture. "Maybe a night in lockup will teach you some respect," Manning had growled, loud enough for the watching crowd to hear. The words were designed to humiliate, to reduce Luke from a law school graduate to just another criminal in the system Manning controlled. The patrol car sat at the bottom of the courthouse steps like a vulture, waiting to feast on dignity. Manning opened the back door with one hand while maintaining his grip on Luke's arm with the other. The young man didn't resist. Resistance would only give Manning the excuse for violence he was clearly hoping for, but his posture remained straight, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. "Watch your head," Manning said with mock courtesy as he pushed Luke into the back seat. But he pushed hard enough that Luke's shoulder hit the door frame anyway. Another small cruelty. Another tiny violation designed to chip away at a young man's sense of self-worth. As Manning slammed the door, the sound echoed across the courthouse plaza like a gunshot announcing the death of justice. Through the patrol car's window, Luke could see the building where he'd planned to start his legal career, where he'd hoped to begin making the world more fair, more just, more aligned with the principles his father had taught him. Now he was seeing it from the back of a police car, arrested for nothing more than existing while black in a space where he belonged. Manning climbed into the driver's seat, adjusting his rearview mirror so he could watch Luke's face. He was looking for the moment when dignity would crack, when the young man would finally break down and give him the satisfaction he'd been craving. But Luke stared straight ahead, his expression calm despite the storm that had to be raging inside him. "First time in handcuffs?" Manning asked, his tone conversational, but with an undercurrent of malice. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it. Your type always does." Your type. The words hung in the air like poison gas, revealing the true motivation behind everything that had just happened. This wasn't about law enforcement or public safety or any of the noble purposes Manning's badge was supposed to represent. This was about Manning's need to put a young black man in his place, to remind him that all the education and dignity and professional ambition in the world couldn't protect him from the casual cruelty of a system that saw his skin color before it saw his character. Luke said nothing. His father had taught him that silence could be its own form of resistance, that refusing to give someone the reaction they wanted was sometimes the most powerful response possible. So he sat quietly as Manning drove toward the station, his mind already working through the legal implications of what had just happened, already cataloging the violations of his rights that had occurred in full view of dozens of witnesses. What Luke didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he sat in the back of that patrol car while Manning hummed tunelessly to himself, was that in 37 minutes, his father would be taking the bench in courtroom 3B for a disciplinary hearing. The case on the docket was a misconduct complaint against a police officer who had been accused of excessive force, racial profiling, and abuse of authority. The officer's name was Jackson Manning, and the judge who would decide Manning's fate, the man whose gavel would determine whether Jackson Manning kept his badge or lost everything, was about to learn that the young man he had just humiliated on the courthouse steps was his own son. The wheels of justice, Judge William Thornton had always believed, moved slowly but inexorably toward truth. Today, they were about to move with the speed of a father's fury and the precision of a lifetime spent believing that the law, when properly applied, could make the world more just. Jackson Manning had no idea that his casual cruelty was about to collide with something much larger than his badge, a father's love armed with the full authority of the bench, and a system of justice that was about to remember what it was supposed to protect. Judge William Thornton's chambers existed in that rare space where authority met wisdom, where power served justice rather than commanding it. The mahogany bookshelves that lined the walls weren't just decoration, they were weapons, filled with constitutional law texts, civil rights precedents, and judicial philosophy that had been earned through 3 decades of believing that the law could be more than words on paper if the right person held the gavel. At 58, Judge Thornton carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had never confused position with purpose. His graying temples and deep-set eyes spoke of years spent weighing evidence, parsing testimony, and making decisions that shaped lives. The black judicial robe hanging behind his desk wasn't just a uniform, it was a responsibility he wore like armor, protecting the principles that lesser men often abandoned when convenience called. This Tuesday afternoon, Judge Thornton was preparing for what appeared to be a routine disciplinary hearing. The file on his desk was thick with complaints, witness statements, and internal affairs reports that painted a disturbing picture of a police officer who had forgotten that his badge was meant to protect, not punish. Officer Jackson Manning, 17 years on the force, multiple complaints of excessive force, a pattern of behavior that suggested someone who viewed his authority as a weapon rather than a tool of justice. Judge Thornton opened the file with the methodical precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. Each page told a story of power abused, trust violated, citizens degraded by someone who had sworn to serve and protect. The complaints stretched back years. A young Hispanic man roughed up during a traffic stop, an elderly black woman handcuffed in her own home during a wellness check, a college student hospitalized after what Manning had described as resisting arrest, but witnesses called unprovoked assault. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Manning wasn't just a bad cop. He was a predator in uniform, someone who had learned to use his badge to inflict the kind of casual cruelty that the system often overlooked, especially when the victims were people society had trained itself not to see. The first complaint in Manning's file dated back 7 years. Maria Gonzalez, 19 years old, had been walking home from her job at a local grocery store when Manning pulled her over for what he called suspicious behavior. The suspicious behavior, according to the report, was walking while Hispanic in a neighborhood where Manning felt she didn't belong. He'd searched her backpack without consent, finding nothing except textbooks and a work uniform. When Maria had asked why she was being detained, Manning had told her to shut up and show some respect before shoving her against his patrol car hard enough to leave bruises on her shoulder. Maria's complaint had been filed with Internal Affairs. 3 days later, the investigating officer, Manning's partner at the time, had found no evidence of wrongdoing. The case was closed within a week, filed away like it had never happened. Maria Gonzalez learned what many citizens discovered when they tried to hold officers accountable. The system protected its own, even when its own didn't deserve protection. Judge Thornton had seen officers like Manning before. They came before his bench with their pressed uniforms and rehearsed explanations. their department lawyers arguing about split-second decisions and the stress of police work. Some judges listened to those arguments and found ways to excuse the inexcusable. Judge Thornton was not one of those judges. He believed in law enforcement, believed in it deeply, genuinely, completely. His own brother had been a police officer, had served with honor and dignity until the day he died, protecting a family from a domestic violence situation that had turned deadly. Judge Thornton understood the dangers that good cops faced, the impossible decisions they had to make, the weight of keeping communities safe in a world that seemed to grow more dangerous every day. But he also understood that a badge didn't make someone above the law. It made them more accountable to it. Every officer who abused their authority, every cop who forgot that their power came with responsibility, made the job harder for the good ones. They eroded public trust, created the kind of fear and resentment that made real police work nearly impossible. The second complaint against Manning involved Robert Washington, a 67-year-old retired teacher who had called police when he heard breaking glass in his neighbor's yard. Manning had arrived on scene and immediately assumed that Robert, a black man standing in his own driveway, was the perpetrator rather than the person who had called for help. When Robert tried to explain that he lived there, Manning had ordered him to put his hands behind his back. "I don't care what you say, old man," Manning had told him, according to the complaint. "I'll decide who belongs where." Robert had been handcuffed in his own driveway, in front of neighbors who had known him for 30 years, while Manning searched his house without a warrant. The real burglar had escaped during the confusion, leaving behind evidence that proved Robert's innocence. But Manning never apologized, never acknowledged his mistake. Instead, he'd written a report claiming that Robert had been uncooperative and potentially threatening. Robert's complaint was also dismissed by Internal Affairs. No wrongdoing found. Case closed. Manning's file represented everything Judge Thornton despised about the system he'd spent his career trying to improve. The officer's misconduct wasn't just criminal, it was corrosive, eating away at the foundation of justice itself. Each dismissed complaint, each ignored pattern of abuse, each protected predator made the system less trustworthy, less effective, less worthy of the respect it demanded. Judge Thornton's secretary, Mrs. Chen, knocked softly on his door. She'd been working with him for 12 years, had learned to read his moods and respect his preparation time. She wouldn't interrupt unless it was important. "Come in, Margaret," he said, not looking up from Manning's file. Mrs. Chen entered with her usual efficiency, carrying a stack of messages and a concerned expression that Judge Thornton had learned to recognize. Something was weighing on her mind. "Your Honor, there are 3 reporters waiting outside. They're asking about the Manning hearing." Judge Thornton looked up, his eyebrows raised slightly. Press attention wasn't unusual for high-profile cases, but disciplinary hearings rarely drew media interest unless something had leaked or someone had decided to make the case public. Did they say what their interest was? One of them mentioned new evidence. Another said something about additional witnesses coming forward. They seemed to think this case was bigger than a simple misconduct hearing. Judge Thornton nodded slowly. In his experience, cases that attracted media attention had a way of revealing themselves to be more complex than they initially appeared. Sometimes that complexity led to justice. Sometimes it led to circus. His job was to ensure it led to truth. The third complaint in Manning's file involved Sarah Mitchell, a 22-year-old college student who had been pulled over for what Manning claimed was a broken taillight. The taillight wasn't broken. Multiple witnesses confirmed this, but Manning had used the pretext to search Sarah's car anyway. When she asked to see his warrant, Manning had grabbed her arm hard enough to leave fingerprint bruises. "You don't get to ask me questions," he had told her. "I ask the questions. You shut up and do what you're told." Sarah had been studying criminal justice, had known her rights, had tried to assert them respectfully. Manning's response had been to arrest her for obstruction of justice and failure to comply with lawful orders. The charges were dropped when the district attorney reviewed the case and found no evidence of any crime except the one Manning had committed against Sarah's civil rights. But Manning faced no consequences. Internal Affairs found his actions within departmental guidelines. Case closed. Schedule a brief meeting with them after the hearing, Judge Thornton said to Mrs. Chen, and make sure court security is prepared for a larger than usual crowd. Mrs. Chen made notes on her tablet, then hesitated. Judge Thornton recognized the pause. She had something else to say, something that was bothering her. What is it, Margaret? Your Honor, I've been reading about Officer Manning's history. Some of the complaints, they're disturbing, and the way they were handled by his department. Judge Thornton set down his pen and gave her his full attention. Mrs. Chen wasn't dramatic or prone to overstatement. If something was troubling her, it was worth hearing. Go on. Several of the complaints were filed by families, Your Honor. Mothers calling about their sons being harassed. Fathers reporting that their daughters were treated inappropriately during traffic stops. And in almost every case, the department found no wrongdoing, no discipline, no consequences. Judge Thornton had noticed the same pattern. Manning's file was thick with complaints, but thin on accountability. Someone in his chain of command had been protecting him, or the system itself was so broken that clear misconduct was being routinely ignored. The fourth complaint involved Marcus Johnson, a 28-year-old nurse who had been stopped while walking to work at the local hospital. Manning had claimed Marcus fit the description of a robbery suspect, though the only similarity was that both men were black and wearing dark clothing. When Marcus showed his hospital ID and explained where he was going, Manning had told him that IDs can be faked and ordered him to submit to a pat-down search. During the search, Manning had been deliberately rough, pressing Marcus against a chain-link fence, hard enough to tear his scrubs. When Marcus winced from the pain, Manning had accused him of acting suspicious and possibly concealing weapons. The search revealed nothing except Marcus's stethoscope and the insulin pen he carried for his diabetes. Marcus had filed a complaint the next day. Internal Affairs had dismissed it within a week, claiming there was insufficient evidence of wrongdoing. The fact that Manning had stopped a man who looked nothing like the actual suspect, who was later arrested and found to be 6 inches shorter and 50 pounds lighter than Marcus, was deemed irrelevant. That's why we're here today, Judge Thornton said quietly to Mrs. Chen, to make sure that pattern ends. Mrs. Chen nodded and turned to leave, but Judge Thornton called her back. Margaret, what time is Luke supposed to be home tonight? Mrs. Chen smiled. She'd watched Luke grow up, had seen him graduate from high school, college, and law school. She'd been almost as proud as Judge Thornton when Luke passed the bar exam 3 months ago. He said he had an appointment this afternoon about a possible internship. Then he was planning to study for that job interview tomorrow. I'd guess he'll be home by 7. Judge Thornton smiled. Luke had inherited his mother's determination and his father's sense of justice. The internship he was pursuing was with the public defender's office, not the most lucrative career path, but one that aligned with the values Judge Thornton had tried to instill in his son. Luke wanted to defend people who couldn't defend themselves, to be the voice for those the system often ignored. It was exactly what Judge Thornton would have chosen for him, if the choice had been his to make. Luke had grown up hearing stories about justice and injustice, about the power of the law to protect the innocent, and the responsibility that came with wielding that power. He'd seen his father agonize over difficult decisions, had watched him work late into the night crafting rulings that would stand up to appeal and serve the cause of justice. Luke understood that the law wasn't just about rules and procedures. It was about human dignity, about creating a society where everyone was treated with equal respect, regardless of their race, their economic status, or their position in society. That understanding had shaped his decision to pursue public defense work, to represent the people who often found themselves on the wrong side of officers like Manning. Tell him I might be late tonight, Judge Thornton said. Depending on how this hearing goes, I may need to stay and write a detailed ruling. Mrs. Chen left, closing the door softly behind her. Judge Thornton returned to Manning's file, but his mind lingered on his son. Luke was everything a father could hope for. Intelligent, principled, hard-working, determined to make the world better than he found it. Judge Thornton had raised him to believe in justice, to trust in the system, to have faith that the law could protect the innocent and punish the guilty. Soon, Luke would be working within that system, would see its flaws and limitations up close. Judge Thornton hoped his son would maintain his idealism despite those inevitable disappointments. The law needed people like Luke, people who still believed it could be better, who were willing to fight to make it better. The fifth complaint in Manning's file was perhaps the most disturbing. Jennifer Williams, a 34-year-old social worker, had been conducting a home visit to check on a family when Manning arrived, responding to a noise complaint. Instead of speaking with Jennifer professionally, Manning had immediately assumed she was part of whatever problem he'd been called to address. "What are you doing here?" he had demanded, not identifying himself as an officer or asking for her identification. When Jennifer explained that she was a licensed social worker conducting an official visit, Manning had laughed. "Social worker? You look more like a troublemaker to me." Manning had handcuffed Jennifer in front of the children she was there to help, traumatizing kids who were already vulnerable and destroying the trust she had spent months building with the family. The complaint Jennifer filed included statements from the children's mother, confirming that Manning had used excessive force and inappropriate language throughout the encounter. Internal Affairs had dismissed the complaint, claiming that Manning's actions were appropriate, given the circumstances. The fact that Jennifer had proper identification, had explained her presence multiple times, and had done nothing to warrant arrest, was deemed irrelevant. Case closed. Judge Thornton's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, expecting a routine administrative update. Instead, he saw a message from Luke. "Dad, something happened today that I need to talk to you about. Not urgent, but when you have time. Love you." Judge Thornton frowned slightly. Luke wasn't dramatic or prone to overstatement, much like Mrs. Chen. If he said something had happened, something had happened. Judge Thornton typed back quickly. "Everything okay? I'm in court until late, but can talk tonight." The response came immediately. "I'm fine. Just something I want to run by you. We'll talk later." Judge Thornton set his phone aside, but the text nagged at him. Luke was careful with words, precise in his communication. Something happened could mean anything from a difficult conversation with a professor to a problem with his car. But the fact that Luke had reached out in the middle of the day suggested it was something that couldn't wait until their usual evening check-in. The final pages of Manning's file contained the most recent complaints, including one that had prompted this hearing. 3 weeks ago, Manning had stopped David Rodriguez, a 41-year-old father of 3, for what he claimed was a traffic violation. Witnesses later testified that David had committed no violation. He had been driving carefully, following all traffic laws, when Manning pulled him over for reasons that remained unclear. During the stop, Manning had become increasingly aggressive, ordering David out of the car and conducting what appeared to be a punitive search. When David asked why he was being searched, Manning had shoved him against the hood of his car. "Because I said so," Manning had replied. "And if you don't like it, we can continue this conversation downtown." David had remained calm, had cooperated fully, had done everything right. But Manning had arrested him anyway, charging him with failure to comply and suspicious behavior. The charges were dropped when the district attorney reviewed the case and found no evidence of any crime. But this time was different. This time, David Rodriguez had connections in the community. His brother was a city councilman. His wife was a local teacher, and their story had attracted media attention. People were asking questions about Manning's pattern of behavior, about why so many complaints had been dismissed, about whether the system was protecting a predator in uniform. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Chen's voice called through the wood. "Your Honor, it's time." Judge Thornton closed Manning's file and stood, reaching for his robe. The weight of it on his shoulders was familiar, comforting. For 23 years, this robe had been his reminder that he served something larger than himself, something more important than his personal feelings or preferences. Today, that service would involve holding Officer Jackson Manning accountable for his actions. Judge Thornton had read every complaint, every witness statement, every internal affairs report. He'd reviewed the videos, the photographs, the medical records. He'd seen the pattern of behavior that Manning's supervisors had chosen to ignore. That pattern would end today. Judge Thornton walked through the corridors toward courtroom 3B. nodding to bailiffs and court officers who had worked with him for years. They respected him not because of his position, but because of how he filled it. He'd earned their trust by being fair, consistent, and unwavering in his commitment to justice. As he approached the courtroom, Judge Thornton could hear the murmur of voices inside. The hearing was drawing more attention than he'd expected. He hoped that attention would send a message, not just to Manning, but to every officer who thought their badge made them untouchable. Judge Thornton paused outside the courtroom door, took a deep breath, and prepared to enter. He had no idea that the young man Officer Manning had arrested 47 minutes earlier was his own son. He had no idea that the case he was about to hear had become personal in ways he couldn't imagine. All he knew was that a police officer who had forgotten his duty was about to face a judge who had never forgotten his. The gavel in Judge Thornton's hand would soon carry the weight of both justice and blood, though he wouldn't know it until the moment he looked into Officer Manning's eyes and saw not just guilt, but terror. The terror of a man who had just realized he was facing the father of the young man he had humiliated on the courthouse steps. Justice, Judge Thornton had always believed, had a way of finding its target. Today it would find Jackson Manning. Judge William Thornton was halfway through Manning's disciplinary hearing when his phone vibrated against his chest. The device was always set to silent during court proceedings. 23 years on the bench had taught him that justice demanded complete attention, undivided focus, respect for the gravity of legal proceedings. But this vibration felt different, insistent, like an emergency trying to break through his professional barriers. He ignored it. Officer Jackson Manning sat at the defendant's table, his uniform pressed and perfect, his expression carefully neutral. His attorney, a sharp-dressed woman from the police union, was presenting a defense built on technicalities and procedural objections. Manning himself had said very little, letting his lawyer do the talking while he maintained the stoic demeanor of a man who believed his badge would protect him from consequences. Judge Thornton had been listening to testimony for 90 minutes. Witnesses had described Manning's pattern of behavior, the unnecessary force, the racial profiling, the casual cruelty disguised as law enforcement. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, clear. Manning wasn't just guilty of misconduct, he was guilty of systematically abusing his authority to terrorize citizens who had done nothing wrong. The phone vibrated again, then again. Judge Thornton's jaw tightened slightly. Emergency calls were routed through Mrs. Chen, who had strict instructions never to interrupt court proceedings unless someone was dying or the building was on fire. Whatever was happening outside this courtroom, it would have to wait. Justice was being served, and justice didn't pause for phone calls. Manning's attorney was arguing that her client's actions had been within departmental guidelines, that the complaints against him were exaggerated or misunderstood, that good officers shouldn't be punished for doing difficult jobs in dangerous circumstances. Judge Thornton had heard these arguments before, from lawyers defending officers who had forgotten that their badge was meant to protect citizens, not terrorize them. The phone vibrated a fourth time. Judge Thornton called a brief recess. "We'll resume in 10 minutes, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never confused patience with weakness. Manning and his attorney huddled in quiet conversation while Judge Thornton stepped into his chambers, his robe billowing behind him like storm clouds gathering before lightning. Mrs. Chen was waiting for him, her face pale with the kind of controlled panic that comes before terrible news. In her hand was his phone, the screen lit up with missed calls and text messages. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her eyes, "Luke has been arrested." The words hit Judge Thornton like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and leaving him momentarily speechless. Luke arrested? His son, the law school graduate, the young man who had never even received a speeding ticket, who had been raised to respect authority and understand the law. "What are the charges?" Judge Thornton asked, his judicial training taking over even as his heart hammered against his ribs. "Disorderly conduct, failure to comply with a lawful order, public disturbance," Mrs. Chen read from her notes. "He was arrested on the courthouse steps approximately 2 hours ago." Judge Thornton's mind raced. The courthouse steps, the very building where he now sat, the sacred ground where justice was supposed to be served, not violated. Someone had arrested his son within sight of the courtroom where Judge Thornton was presiding over a police misconduct hearing. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. "Which officer made the arrest?" he asked, though something cold and terrible was already forming in his stomach, a suspicion that felt like swallowing ice. Mrs. Chen looked down at her notes, then back up at Judge Thornton with eyes that held the weight of revelation. "Officer Jackson Manning, Your Honor." The silence that followed was the kind that exists between lightning and thunder, between cause and effect, between the moment when justice becomes personal and the moment when a father's fury meets judicial authority. Judge Thornton stood perfectly still, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles went white. Officer Jackson Manning, the same man sitting in his courtroom, the same predator in uniform whose misconduct hearing Judge Thornton had been presiding over, had arrested his son. The man whose pattern of racial profiling and abuse of authority Judge Thornton had been reviewing for weeks, had targeted Luke, had put handcuffs on a young black man whose only crime was existing while educated, dignified, and successful. "Where is Luke now?" Judge Thornton asked, his voice carefully controlled, each word measured and precise. "He was released an hour ago. No charges were filed. The arresting officers apparently realized there was no basis for the arrest. Luke is on his way home." Judge Thornton closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Luke was safe, unharmed, free, but the violation had already occurred. Manning had put his hands on Judge Thornton's son, had humiliated him in public, had treated him like a criminal for the sin of being young and black in a space where Manning felt he didn't belong. The text messages Luke had sent earlier suddenly made sense. "Something happened today that I need to talk to you about." Luke had tried to reach out, had wanted to tell his father what had occurred, but he had been respectful of court proceedings, had waited for an appropriate time to share the news that would transform this hearing from a professional duty into something deeply, intensely personal. Mrs. Chen was watching Judge Thornton carefully, recognizing the storm that was building behind his judicial composure. She had worked with him long enough to know that his stillness was not calm. It was the eye of a hurricane, the moment before fury and justice collided with devastating effect. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "what do you want to do?" It was a simple question with complex implications. Judge Thornton could recuse himself from the case, could step aside and let another judge handle Manning's hearing. That would be the safe choice, the one that avoided any appearance of impropriety or conflict of interest. Manning's attorney would certainly demand recusal if she learned that her client had arrested the presiding judge's son. But recusal would also mean that Manning might escape consequences. Other judges might not have read his file as carefully, might not understand the pattern of behavior, might be more susceptible to the police union's arguments about split-second decisions and officer safety. Manning could walk away from this hearing with a reprimand, a brief suspension, a slap on the wrist that would allow him to continue terrorizing citizens. Judge Thornton thought about all the complaints in Manning's file: Maria Gonzalez, Robert Washington, Sarah Mitchell, Marcus Johnson, Jennifer Williams, David Rodriguez, all the victims who had tried to seek justice and been dismissed by a system that protected predators in uniform. All the families who had been told their pain didn't matter, their dignity didn't count, their rights didn't exist when they conflicted with an officer's authority. And now Luke was part of that pattern. His son had been arrested, humiliated, treated like a criminal by the same officer whose misconduct hearing Judge Thornton was presiding over. The coincidence was so stark, so perfect, that it felt like the universe demanding justice. "Has Luke spoken to anyone about what happened?" Judge Thornton asked. "He called me from the station. He said he wanted to handle it quietly, didn't want to cause problems for you or your court. He's more concerned about protecting your reputation than seeking justice for himself." That was Luke, always thinking about others, always trying to do the right thing, even when the system had failed him. Judge Thornton had raised his son to believe in justice, to trust that the law would protect him, to have faith that good would triumph over evil if good people stood up and demanded it. Manning had shattered that faith in handcuffing Luke on the courthouse steps. He had attacked not just a young man, but everything Judge Thornton had taught his son to believe about justice, fairness, and the rule of law. Judge Thornton's phone buzzed again, a text from Luke. "Dad, I'm okay. Don't do anything that could compromise your position. I love you and I'm proud of you no matter what happens." Even after being arrested, humiliated, and violated by the system his father served, Luke was still protecting him, still believing in the importance of judicial integrity, still trusting that justice would find a way to prevail. Judge Thornton looked at Mrs. Chen with eyes that had gone from judicial to paternal, from professional to personal. "Margaret, in your opinion, would my continuing to preside over this hearing compromise the integrity of the proceedings?" Mrs. Chen considered the question carefully. She understood what Judge Thornton was really asking, not whether he could legally continue, but whether he should ethically continue, whether his personal involvement would taint the pursuit of justice. "Your Honor," she said slowly, "you've been preparing for this hearing for weeks. You know Manning's history better than any other judge in this building. You've read every complaint, reviewed every piece of evidence, studied every witness statement. If you recuse yourself now, Manning might face a judge who hasn't done that preparation, who doesn't understand the full scope of his misconduct." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "And Your Honor, what happened to Luke doesn't change the facts of this case. It doesn't alter the evidence against Manning or make the complaints against him any less valid. If anything, it proves that the pattern of behavior described in those complaints is real, current, and ongoing." Judge Thornton nodded slowly. Mrs. Chen was right. His personal involvement didn't change the law, didn't alter the evidence, didn't make Manning's misconduct any less serious. If anything, it demonstrated that Manning was exactly the kind of officer described in the complaints, someone who saw young black men as threats to be neutralized, rather than citizens to be protected. "There's something else, Your Honor," Mrs. Chen added. "Luke was arrested on courthouse property, in full view of security cameras. The entire incident was recorded. If Manning claims he had probable cause, or that Luke was acting suspiciously, the video evidence will contradict him." Judge Thornton's eyes hardened. Manning had arrested his son on camera, in front of the building dedicated to justice, while Judge Thornton was inside, presiding over a hearing about Manning's misconduct. The officer's arrogance was breathtaking, his confidence in his own untouchability absolute. That confidence was about to be shattered. "I'm going to continue presiding over this hearing," Judge Thornton said, his voice carrying the weight of both judicial authority and paternal determination. "Manning's misconduct needs to be addressed by someone who understands its full scope and implications. The fact that he arrested my son doesn't disqualify me from hearing his case. It confirms everything the complainants have been saying about his character and conduct." Mrs. Chen nodded. "What about disclosure? Manning's attorney will need to know about the connection." "I'll disclose it when court resumes. I'll give Manning and his attorney the opportunity to request a different judge if they choose. But I suspect they'll want to continue with me. They'll think my personal involvement gives them grounds for appeal if they lose." Judge Thornton straightened his robe and picked up Manning's file. The pages felt heavier now, weighted with personal knowledge of the officer's cruelty, but they also felt more important, more urgent, more necessary. Justice wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was personal, immediate, and absolutely essential. "Margaret, please call Luke and tell him I love him and that we'll talk tonight. Tell him that what happened to him won't be ignored or dismissed. Tell him that sometimes justice requires personal sacrifice, and today might be one of those days." Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time since delivering the news. She recognized the look in Judge Thornton's eyes. It was the same expression he wore when he was about to deliver a ruling that would reshape someone's understanding of accountability. Judge Thornton walked back toward the courtroom, his steps measured and purposeful. Behind him, Mrs. Chen was already dialing Luke's number, preparing to deliver a message that would let a young man know his father had heard him, believed him, and was about to ensure that justice was served. In courtroom 3B, Officer Jackson Manning was about to learn that some consequences couldn't be avoided, some patterns couldn't be protected, and some judges couldn't be intimidated. He was about to discover that the young man he had arrested on the courthouse steps wasn't just another victim to be processed through his system of casual cruelty. He was the son of the man who held Manning's future in his hands. And that man was about to teach Manning what real authority looked like when it was wielded in service of justice rather than in pursuit of power. Jackson Manning had been a predator in uniform for so long that he had forgotten there was any other way to be a police officer. 17 years of getting away with casual cruelty had taught him that his badge was a license to inflict his personal prejudices on anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. The system that was supposed to hold him accountable had instead become his accomplice, protecting him from consequences while enabling him to terrorize citizens who looked like Luke Thornton. Manning's journey from cop to predator hadn't happened overnight. It had been a gradual descent, each unpunished abuse of power making the next one easier, each dismissed complaint reinforcing his belief that he was untouchable. The system hadn't just failed to stop him, it had actively encouraged him, sending the message that his victims' pain mattered less than his comfort, that their dignity was negotiable but his authority was sacred. The first time Manning had crossed the line, he'd been nervous, uncertain, aware that he was violating both his oath and his training. That was 12 years ago, during a traffic stop involving a young black woman who had asked too many questions about why she was being pulled over. Manning had grabbed her arm harder than necessary, had spoken to her with a disrespect that bordered on cruelty, had made her feel small and powerless because it made him feel big and important. She had filed a complaint. Manning had spent sleepless nights wondering if his career was over, if his actions would finally catch up with him. But his supervisor had called him into the office with a shrug and a smile. "These people complain about everything," the supervisor had said, as if the young woman's civil rights were a minor inconvenience rather than constitutional guarantees. "Don't worry about it. We've got your back." The complaint was dismissed. No investigation, no discipline, no consequences. Manning learned that day that the system would protect him as long as he was hurting the right people. People society had already decided didn't matter, people whose pain could be ignored without political cost. That protection had continued for 17 years. Every complaint dismissed, every witness ignored, every victim told that their experience didn't count because the officer's word carried more weight than their truth. Manning had learned to recognize the people he could hurt without consequences. Young black men, Hispanic families, poor people without connections, immigrants who feared deportation more than police abuse. Luke Thornton had checked every box on Manning's list of acceptable targets. Young, black, well-dressed, in a way that Manning interpreted as arrogance, standing in a space where Manning felt he didn't belong. The fact that Luke was intelligent, educated, and successful only made Manning's need to humiliate him more intense. Successful black men represented everything Manning resented about a changing world. They had opportunities he felt should belong to people who looked like him, respect he believed should be automatically granted to anyone wearing his uniform. What Manning didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he handcuffed Luke on the courthouse steps, was that he had just arrested someone whose achievements made Manning's mediocrity even more glaring. Luke Thornton wasn't just another young black man to be processed through Manning's system of casual cruelty. He was someone whose accomplishments demanded respect, whose character commanded admiration, whose potential represented everything the system was supposed to protect rather than destroy. Luke had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University with a degree in criminal justice, had spent summers working with civil rights organizations, had written his senior thesis on racial bias in policing. He had seen Manning's type before, had studied them, understood them, recognized the pattern of behavior that turned badges into weapons and uniforms into costumes for bullies. After college, Luke had attended law school at Georgetown, where he had focused on constitutional law and civil rights litigation. His professors had recognized his potential immediately. Here was a young man who understood both the promise and the failure of the American legal system, who had the intelligence to navigate its complexities and the character to demand it live up to its ideals. Luke's law school career had been marked by excellence and service. He had graduated in the top 10% of his class, had served as editor of the Law Review, had won the award for outstanding achievement in constitutional law. But more than his academic success, Luke had demonstrated the kind of moral courage that separated good lawyers from great ones. During his second year, Luke had represented a homeless veteran who had been beaten by police during a welfare check. The case was unpopular, the victim unsympathetic to many, The chances of success slim. But Luke had worked tirelessly, had uncovered evidence of police misconduct, had forced the city to settle for enough money to get the veteran into housing and treatment. The case hadn't made headlines, but it had made a difference in one man's life, and that, Luke had learned from his father, was what justice was really about. During his third year, Luke had clerked for a federal judge who handled civil rights cases. He had seen how the system could work when good people demanded accountability, how the law could protect the vulnerable when it was properly applied. But he had also seen how often the system failed, how prejudice and indifference could corrupt even well-intentioned institutions. The judge Luke had clerked for was Judge Patricia Williams, an African-American woman who had broken barriers throughout her career and never forgotten the struggles that had brought her to the bench. She had recognized in Luke a kindred spirit, someone who understood that the law was only as good as the people who enforced it, that justice required constant vigilance against those who would corrupt it for personal gain. Luke, she had told him during his final week of clerking, you have the potential to be a great lawyer, but more importantly, you have the character to be a good man. Don't let the system's failures make you cynical. Be the change you want to see. Those words had guided Luke's decision to pursue public defense work, rather than the corporate law career that his grades and connections could have secured. He wanted to represent people like the ones Manning victimized, people who needed someone to stand up for them, someone who understood that dignity wasn't determined by wealth or status, but by simple humanity. The internship Luke had been pursuing when Manning arrested him was with the Public Defender's Office, specifically in their Civil Rights Division. He had been walking to an interview that could have launched his career, defending people against officers like Manning. The irony was perfect, cosmic, the kind of poetic justice that existed only in stories, except this was real life, and the consequences were real too. Manning's personnel file told a different story than Luke's academic record. Where Luke's achievements spoke of excellence and service, Manning's record spoke of mediocrity, protected by institutional corruption. Manning had never been promoted beyond patrol officer, had never received commendations for outstanding service, had never been recognized for going above and beyond the call of duty. Instead, Manning's file was filled with the kind of complaints that should have ended his career years ago. But each complaint had been handled by supervisors who saw Manning as one of their own, who understood that protecting him meant protecting the system that allowed them all to operate without accountability. Captain Robert Hayes had been Manning's supervisor for 8 years, and he had dismissed more complaints against Manning than any other supervisor in department history. Hayes saw Manning as a real cop, someone who wasn't afraid to be tough, who understood that policing sometimes required force, who didn't let political correctness interfere with law enforcement. Manning gets results. Hayes would tell internal affairs investigators, he keeps the streets safe. These complaints are just people trying to get rich off the city. Hayes had never asked what kind of results Manning was getting, had never questioned whether keeping the streets safe required terrorizing law-abiding citizens. He had simply protected Manning because Manning represented Hayes's vision of what policing should be, uncompromising, unquestioning, and unaccountable to anyone except other officers. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison had also protected Manning, though for different reasons. Morrison was ambitious, politically connected, and smart enough to understand that challenging Manning would mean challenging the entire system that had elevated her to lieutenant. She had chosen career advancement over constitutional principles, personal success over public service. Officer Manning operates within departmental guidelines. Morrison would write in her reports, even when Manning's actions clearly violated both policy and law. She had learned that protecting bad cops was the price of admission to the department's inner circle, that accountability was a luxury she couldn't afford if she wanted to advance her career. The pattern of protection had continued throughout Manning's career. Every supervisor who could have stopped him had chosen not to. Every administrator who could have held him accountable had looked the other way. The system hadn't just failed, it had actively enabled Manning's predatory behavior, turning police work into a hunting ground for someone who enjoyed inflicting pain on people who couldn't fight back. But Manning's protection had always depended on targeting the right victims. People society was willing to sacrifice. people whose pain could be ignored without political cost. He had learned to avoid arresting people with connections, people with resources, people who could make his life difficult. He had developed an instinct for identifying safe targets, people who could be victimized without consequences. That instinct had failed him when he arrested Luke Thornton. Luke wasn't just another young black man to be processed through Manning's system of casual cruelty. He was the son of Judge William Thornton, a man whose reputation for fairness and integrity was matched only by his intolerance for police misconduct. Luke had connections Manning couldn't imagine, resources Manning couldn't counter, and protection Manning couldn't penetrate. More importantly, Luke had been raised by someone who understood both the promise and the failure of the American legal system. Someone who had spent 23 years on the bench, ensuring that the law protected the innocent and punished the guilty. Judge Thornton had taught his son to believe in justice, but he had also given him the tools to demand it when the system failed. Manning's arrest of Luke had been captured on courthouse security cameras from multiple angles. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no way to claim that Luke had been acting suspiciously or failing to comply with lawful orders. The video showed exactly what it was: a police officer abusing his authority to humiliate a young black man who had done nothing wrong. But even more damaging than the video evidence was the timing. Manning had arrested Luke while Judge Thornton was presiding over Manning's own misconduct hearing. While the judge was reviewing evidence of Manning's pattern of racial profiling and abuse of authority, the arrest proved that Manning was exactly the kind of officer described in the complaints against him. Someone who saw young black men as threats to be neutralized rather than citizens to be protected. The system that had protected Manning for 17 years was about to abandon him. The supervisors who had dismissed complaints against him would suddenly discover their commitment to accountability. The police union representatives who had defended his actions would find reasons to distance themselves from his case. The politicians who had enabled his misconduct would discover their concern for civil rights. Manning didn't know it yet, but his arrest of Luke Thornton had sealed his fate. He had finally targeted someone the system couldn't ignore, someone whose pain mattered to people with power, someone whose dignity was protected by more than hope and good intentions. In a few minutes, Manning would walk back into courtroom 3B, expecting to face the same disciplinary hearing he had been attending all morning. He would expect Judge Thornton to continue reviewing his case with the same professional detachment he had shown earlier, the same judicial neutrality that had characterized the proceedings. Manning had no idea that everything had changed. He didn't know that Judge Thornton had learned about Luke's arrest, that the case had become personal in ways Manning couldn't imagine. He didn't know that the young man he had humiliated on the courthouse steps was the son of the man who would decide his fate. Most importantly, Manning didn't know that his 17-year career of victimizing innocent people was about to collide with something much more powerful than his badge, a father's love, armed with the full authority of the bench, and a system of justice that was finally ready to remember what it was supposed to protect. The protection that had shielded Manning for so long was about to evaporate. The system that had enabled his predatory behavior was about to demand accountability, and the badge that had given him license to inflict cruelty was about to become evidence of his unfitness to serve. Jackson Manning was about to learn that some victims couldn't be ignored, some consequences couldn't be avoided, and some judges couldn't be intimidated. He was about to discover what happened when a predator's casual cruelty met a father's focused fury. Justice, Manning was about to learn, had been waiting for him all along. The Thornton family home existed in that rare space where warmth met wisdom, where success had never forgotten its roots, where achievement served community rather than commanding it. The Tudor-style house in the historic district had been Luke's sanctuary for 23 years, the place where he had learned that justice wasn't just a concept but a daily practice, where dinner-table conversations about constitutional law had shaped his understanding of right and wrong. Luke sat in his father's study, still wearing the navy blue suit that had been wrinkled by Manning's handcuffs, still carrying the dignity that Manning had tried to strip away on the courthouse steps. The room around him was filled with law books, judicial opinions, and photographs that told the story of a family committed to service, Pictures of Judge Thornton's swearing-in ceremony, Luke's law school graduation, community events where the Thornton name had become synonymous with fairness and integrity. Judge Thornton arrived home at 7:30, his judicial robe replaced by a simple white shirt and dark slacks, but his eyes still carrying the weight of the decision he had made in chambers. He had recessed Manning's hearing until the following morning, had disclosed to Manning's attorney that the defendant had arrested his son, had given them the night to decide whether they wanted to request a different judge. Father and son looked at each other across the study, and in that moment, the formal distance between judge and citizen, between authority figure and young man, dissolved into something more fundamental, the bond between a father who had dedicated his life to justice and a son who had inherited that commitment along with the scars that came with it. "How are you?" Judge Thornton asked, his voice carrying the tenderness that he reserved for family, the vulnerability that few people ever saw behind his judicial composure. "I'm okay," Luke replied, and both men knew it was both true and incomplete. Luke was physically unharmed, legally cleared, professionally intact, but something deeper had been damaged. Something that would take more than time to heal. Judge Thornton settled into the leather chair across from his son, the same chair where he had helped Luke with homework, where they had discussed college applications, where they had celebrated Luke's acceptance to law school. Tonight, they would discuss something darker, the failure of the system they both served, the violation of principles they both held sacred. "Tell me what happened," Judge Thornton said, his voice gentle, but his eyes sharp with the focus of someone who had spent decades extracting truth from complex situations. Luke began with his walk up the courthouse steps, his mind on the internship interview that had brought him to the building where his father dispensed justice. He described Manning's approach, the casual authority in the officer's voice, the immediate assumption that Luke didn't belong in that space. "He didn't ask for identification," Luke said, his voice steady despite the memory. "Didn't ask what I was doing there. He had already decided I was guilty of something before we even spoke." Judge Thornton listened without interruption, his judicial training keeping his expression neutral while his paternal instincts screamed for justice. He heard the careful precision in Luke's account, the attention to detail that law school had sharpened, the objectivity that came from understanding that facts mattered more than feelings in the pursuit of accountability. Luke described Manning's escalation, the way the officer had transformed a peaceful afternoon into a public humiliation, the casual cruelty with which he had applied the handcuffs, the satisfaction in his voice as he violated Luke's dignity in front of dozens of witnesses. "The worst part wasn't the arrest," Luke said quietly. "It was the realization that he had done this before, probably many times, to people who didn't have the resources to fight back. I kept thinking about all the other young black men who had stood where I was standing, who had been treated the way I was being treated, who had no one to speak for them when it was over." Judge Thornton felt something cold and furious settle in his chest. His son's pain was real and immediate, but Luke's empathy for other victims revealed the depth of character that Manning had tried to crush. Even after being victimized himself, Luke's first concern was for others who had suffered similar treatment. "Did anyone witness the arrest?" Judge Thornton asked, his mind already working through the legal implications, the evidence that would be needed to ensure accountability. "Dozens of people," Luke replied. "Lawyers heading to court, courthouse employees, citizens with business inside. Several people were recording with their phones. And Dad, the entire thing happened in view of the security cameras. There's no ambiguity about what occurred." Judge Thornton nodded. The video evidence would be crucial, would eliminate Manning's ability to claim that Luke had been acting suspiciously or failing to comply with lawful orders. The arrest had been captured from multiple angles by multiple sources, creating an undeniable record of misconduct. "Luke," Judge Thornton said carefully, "Manning is the same officer whose misconduct hearing I was presiding over when this happened. His disciplinary case has been pending for weeks. I've been reviewing evidence of his pattern of racial profiling and abuse of authority." Luke's eyes widened slightly. The coincidence was almost impossible to believe. Manning had arrested the son of the judge who was deciding his professional fate, had victimized the family of the man who held his career in his hands. What does that mean for his case? Luke asked. It means that Manning's misconduct isn't just documented in old complaints, it's current, ongoing, and captured on video. It means that the pattern of behavior described by other victims is proven by what happened to you. Judge Thornton stood and walked to his bookshelf, pulling down a thick volume of constitutional law. The book was worn, marked with years of study and reference, a tool he had used to navigate complex questions of justice and accountability. Manning's attorney will likely argue that I should recuse myself, Judge Thornton said, flipping through pages until he found the section he wanted. They'll claim that my personal involvement compromises my ability to be impartial. Are they right? Luke asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Judge Thornton considered the question carefully. It was the same question he had wrestled with in his chambers. The same conflict between personal involvement and professional duty that had kept him awake since learning of Luke's arrest. Legally, my personal connection doesn't disqualify me from hearing the case, he said finally. The law recognizes that judges are human beings with families, relationships, and personal experiences. What matters is whether I can set aside my personal feelings and render a decision based on evidence and law. Can you? Luke asked. Judge Thornton met his son's eyes. Yes, because what happened to you doesn't change the facts of Manning's case. It confirms them. The evidence against him was overwhelming before today. Your arrest simply proves that the complaints against him are accurate, that his pattern of misconduct is ongoing. Luke nodded slowly. He understood the distinction his father was making between personal vengeance and institutional accountability, between a father's fury and a judge's duty. Judge Thornton's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then showed the screen to Luke. The message was from Mrs. Chen. Channel 7 just aired a story about Luke's arrest. They have security footage and witness interviews. This is going to be big. Luke and Judge Thornton looked at each other, understanding that their private family crisis was about to become public news. The arrest of a judge's son by an officer facing misconduct charges was the kind of story that attracted media attention, political scrutiny, and community outrage. Are you prepared for that? Judge Thornton asked. For having your experience become a public story? Luke thought for a moment before answering. He had never sought publicity, had always preferred to work behind the scenes rather than in the spotlight. But he also understood that his experience was bigger than his personal comfort, that Manning's misconduct needed to be exposed if others were to be protected. If it helps other people understand what Manning has been doing, if it prevents him from victimizing someone else, then yes, Luke said, I'm prepared for that. Judge Thornton felt a surge of pride in his son. Even after being victimized, even facing the prospect of unwanted publicity, Luke was thinking about others, about justice, about the greater good. Manning had tried to crush Luke's dignity, but he had only revealed the strength of character that no amount of abuse could diminish. The phone rang, and Judge Thornton answered to find Mrs. Chen on the line. Your Honor, I'm getting calls from reporters, community leaders, and civil rights organizations. Word is spreading quickly about what happened. People want to know if you're going to continue presiding over Manning's case. What are you telling them? Judge Thornton asked. That you'll address any questions through official channels at the appropriate time. But Your Honor, there's something else. I've been contacted by 3 additional witnesses to Manning's arrest of Luke. They want to provide statements supporting Luke's account. Judge Thornton thanked Mrs. Chen and ended the call. He turned to Luke with a mixture of determination and concern. This is going to become bigger than either of us anticipated. Manning's case was already drawing attention, but now it's going to be a symbol of police accountability, of systemic reform, of whether the justice system can hold its own officers accountable. Luke stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful street where he had grown up, where he had learned to ride a bicycle, where he had played with neighborhood children of all colors and backgrounds. The normalcy of the scene contrasted sharply with the weight of what was happening inside the house. Dad, Luke said without turning around, I want you to know that whatever you decide about Manning's case, I support you. If you think recusing yourself is the right thing to do, I'll understand. If you think continuing is the right thing to do, I'll support that too. Judge Thornton joined his son at the window. What do you think I should do? Luke was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that went to the heart of everything they both believed about justice, accountability, and the rule of law. I think, Luke said finally, that Manning has been getting away with this kind of behavior for too long because the system has been protecting him. I think other judges might not understand the full scope of his misconduct the way you do. I think someone needs to hold him accountable, and you might be the only judge willing to do it. Luke turned to face his father. But I also think that if you continue with the case, people will question your motives. They'll wonder if you're seeking justice or revenge. You'll have to be twice as careful, twice as thorough, twice as fair as you would be with any other case. Judge Thornton nodded. His son had articulated the exact challenge he faced: how to pursue justice without appearing to seek vengeance, how to hold Manning accountable without compromising his own integrity. There's one more thing, Luke added. Manning doesn't know yet that I'm your son. When he finds out tomorrow, when he realizes that the young man he arrested is related to the judge deciding his fate, he's going to panic. He might try to claim the arrest was justified, might try to argue that I was actually acting suspiciously. You need to be prepared for him to lie about what happened. Judge Thornton smiled grimly. Let him try. We have video evidence, witness statements, and a pattern of similar complaints spanning years. Manning can claim whatever he wants. The truth is documented and undeniable. The evening news began at 8 o'clock, and both men sat in the study, watching as Luke's arrest became the lead story. The footage was clear, damning, undeniable. Manning approaching Luke without justification, escalating a peaceful encounter into a public humiliation, arresting a young man who had done nothing wrong. The news anchor was careful to note that Luke was the son of Judge William Thornton, that Manning was facing a misconduct hearing, that the timing of the arrest raised questions about the officer's judgment and character. The story included interviews with witnesses who described Luke as cooperative and respectful, who said Manning's behavior had been inappropriate and unprovoked. By 9 o'clock, Judge Thornton's phone was ringing constantly. Civil rights organizations wanted to know if he would continue presiding over Manning's case. Police union representatives wanted to discuss the possibility of recusal. Community leaders wanted to express their support for accountability and reform. Judge Thornton let the calls go to voicemail. Tomorrow would bring decisions that would shape not just Manning's fate, but the community's faith in the justice system. Tonight was for preparing, for thinking, for ensuring that when the gavel fell, it would fall in service of truth rather than emotion. Luke, Judge Thornton said as the evening news ended, tomorrow is going to be difficult. Manning will have to face the reality that he arrested a judge's son. His attorney will probably try to delay the proceedings, will argue for recusal or change of venue. The media will be watching every move, every word, every decision. Luke nodded. What do you need from me? I need you to be exactly who you are. Honest, principled, and committed to justice. If you're called to testify about what happened, tell the truth completely and objectively. Don't embellish, don't editorialize, just describe what occurred. And if Manning's attorney tries to attack my credibility, Judge Thornton's eyes hardened slightly, then they'll discover that attacking the integrity of a young man who graduated summa cum laude from law school and passed the bar exam on his first try is not a winning strategy. Father and son sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that tomorrow would bring a reckoning that had been 17 years in the making. Manning's pattern of misconduct would finally face accountability, not because a judge sought vengeance, but because the system had finally found its conscience. Justice, they both knew, was not about revenge. It was about ensuring that no other young man would have to experience what Luke had experienced, that no other family would have to suffer what Manning had put them through, that no other officer would be protected by a system that valued badges more than the people those badges were meant to serve. Tomorrow, in Courtroom 3B, Jackson Manning would learn what accountability looked like when it was wielded by someone who understood both its power and its responsibility. Jackson Manning walked into Courtroom 3B at exactly 9 o'clock Wednesday morning with the confident swagger of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his badge polished to a mirror shine, his expression carefully neutral in the way that 17 years of getting away with misconduct had taught him to master. He expected this hearing to proceed like all the others. A few uncomfortable questions, some procedural arguments from his union lawyer, and ultimately a slap on the wrist that would allow him to return to his pattern of predatory behavior. Manning had no idea that everything had changed overnight, that his casual cruelty had finally targeted someone he couldn't safely victimize, that the young black man he had humiliated on the courthouse steps the previous afternoon was sitting in the gallery behind him, waiting for justice to finally catch up with 17 years of accumulated abuse. The courtroom was unusually crowded for a disciplinary hearing. Manning noticed the extra security, the reporters in the back rows, the community leaders and civil rights advocates who had come to witness what many hoped would be a turning point in police accountability. But Manning's attention was focused primarily on his attorney, Sandra Walsh, a sharp-dressed woman from the police union who had built her career defending officers who confused authority with impunity. "How are you feeling about today?" Walsh asked as they settled at the defendant's table. "Confident," Manning replied, his voice carrying the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted that the system would protect him. "These complainants always exaggerate. Judge Thornton will see through their stories once he hears the facts." Walsh nodded, though something in her expression suggested she was less confident than her client. She had spent the morning reviewing news reports about Manning's arrest of Judge Thornton's son, had fielded calls from union representatives who were suddenly less enthusiastic about defending an officer who had made such a spectacular error in judgment. Manning remained oblivious to the shift in his support system. He assumed that his arrest of Luke Thornton would be handled the same way all his other misconduct had been handled, with bureaucratic efficiency, professional courtesy, and ultimate dismissal. He had no idea that Luke was Judge William Thornton's son, had no idea that his actions had transformed a routine disciplinary hearing into something much more personal and consequential. Judge Thornton entered the courtroom at 9:15, his black robes flowing behind him like storm clouds gathering before lightning. Manning stood with everyone else, but he didn't notice the slight hardening in the judge's eyes, the careful control in his movements, the way Judge Thornton's gaze lingered on him for just a moment longer than usual. "Please be seated," Judge Thornton said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never confused patience with weakness. "Before we proceed with today's hearing, I need to address a matter that arose yesterday afternoon." Manning straightened slightly, wondering what administrative issue could be important enough to delay his hearing. His mind was already wandering to his plans for after the hearing, maybe a long lunch, definitely some complaints to his fellow officers about having to waste time on political correctness and citizen complaints. "Yesterday afternoon," Judge Thornton continued, his voice calm but weighted with significance, "Officer Manning arrested a young man on the steps of this courthouse. That young man was my son." The words hit the courtroom like a physical blow. The reporters in the back rows leaned forward, their pens moving quickly across notepads. The community leaders and civil rights advocates who had come to witness the hearing looked at each other with expressions of amazement and vindication. The court officers, who had worked with Judge Thornton for years, watched Manning's face with the fascination of people witnessing a reckoning that had been 17 years in the making. But it was Manning's reaction that captured everyone's attention. The color drained from his face so quickly that for a moment it seemed like he might faint. His confident posture collapsed, his shoulders sagging as the weight of realization settled on him like lead. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again, but no sound emerged. Manning's mind was racing, desperately trying to process what he had just heard. The young black man he had arrested, the one he had handcuffed and humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses, the one he had treated like a criminal for the crime of existing while educated and successful, that was Judge Thornton's son. The judge whose decision would determine whether Manning kept his badge or lost his career. The man whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his intolerance for police misconduct. The authority figure who held Manning's future in his hands. Manning had arrested his son. Manning tried to remember the details of the arrest. tried to recall whether there had been any indication that Luke was connected to the courthouse, any sign that he was more than just another young black man to be processed through Manning's system of casual cruelty. But there had been nothing. Luke had been respectful, cooperative, dignified throughout the encounter. Manning had arrested him purely because he felt like it, because he could, because 17 years of protection had taught him that his badge was a license to inflict his prejudices on anyone unlucky enough to cross his path. Sandra Walsh was staring at her client with barely concealed horror. She had built her career defending police officers, but she had never defended someone who had been stupid enough to arrest a sitting judge's son. The political implications were staggering, the media attention would be relentless, and the chances of a successful defense had just dropped from slim to non-existent. Judge Thornton continued speaking, his voice steady and professional, despite the personal nature of what he was revealing. Given this development, I am offering Officer Manning and his attorney the opportunity to request a different judge for these proceedings. I want to ensure that there is no question about the fairness or impartiality of this hearing. Walsh immediately stood, her legal training overriding her shock. Your Honor, we respectfully request a brief recess to discuss this development with our client. Granted, we'll reconvene in 15 minutes. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Manning sat frozen at the defendant's table, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of his error. He had always been careful to target people who couldn't fight back, people who lacked the resources or connections to challenge his authority. He had developed an instinct for identifying safe victims, people society was willing to sacrifice to his need for power and control. That instinct had catastrophically failed him. Walsh grabbed Manning's arm and guided him to a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom. Once the door was closed, she turned on him with barely controlled fury. Jackson, please tell me you knew who that young man was when you arrested him. Manning shook his head slowly, still stunned by the revelation. I had no idea. He was just, like what? Walsh demanded. Like a young black man who didn't deserve the same respect you'd give to a white person? Like someone whose civil rights didn't matter because of the color of his skin? Manning flinched at the accuracy of her assessment. That was exactly what Luke had looked like to him. Another young black man to be put in his place. Another opportunity to exercise the casual cruelty that Manning had been inflicting on people of color for 17 years. What do we do now? Manning asked, his voice small and uncertain in a way that would have been unrecognizable to the people he had victimized over the years. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that were all terrible. We have three choices. We can request a different judge and hope that whoever replaces Judge Thornton hasn't read your file as carefully. We can ask for a continuance and hope that the media attention dies down. Or we can proceed with Judge Thornton and hope that his reputation for fairness will work in our favor. What do you recommend? Walsh looked at her client with a mixture of pity and disgust. She had defended a lot of officers over the years, had seen misconduct of all kinds, but Manning's case was different. His pattern of behavior wasn't just criminal, it was stupid, reckless, and ultimately self-destructive. Honestly, I recommend that you consider pleading guilty and hoping for leniency. Your arrest of Judge Thornton's son is going to be national news. Every civil rights organization in the country is going to be watching this case. You're not just fighting for your job anymore. You're fighting to stay out of federal prison. Manning's eyes widened. Federal prison? The possibility had never occurred to him. He had always assumed that his badge would protect him, that his union would defend him, that the system would find a way to excuse his behavior as it always had before. Federal prison for what? Civil rights violations, Walsh said bluntly. Deprivation of rights under color of law. The FBI is probably already reviewing your case file, looking for patterns of behavior that could support federal charges. Your arrest of Judge Thornton's son isn't just misconduct, it's evidence of ongoing criminal activity. Manning slumped in his chair, the weight of consequences finally settling on him after 17 years of believing he was untouchable. The protection that had shielded him for so long was evaporating. The system that had enabled his predatory behavior was preparing to abandon him, and the badge that had given him license to inflict cruelty was about to become evidence of his unfitness to serve. Back in the courtroom, Luke Thornton was sitting in the gallery, watching his father prepare for the continuation of the hearing. Luke had arrived early, wearing the same navy blue suit that had been wrinkled by Manning's handcuffs the previous afternoon. His presence in the courtroom was a statement. He was not hiding from what had happened, not allowing Manning's attempt to humiliate him to drive him away from the pursuit of justice. Several community leaders approached Luke during the recess, expressing their support and sharing their own stories of encounters with Manning. Luke listened carefully, understanding that his experience was not unique, that Manning had been victimizing people who looked like him for years. "Your father is a good man," said Reverend Marcus Johnson, a prominent civil rights leader who had been fighting police misconduct for decades. "He's got a chance to send a message that nobody is above the law, not even the officers who are supposed to enforce it." Luke nodded. "He'll do what's right. He always has." Judge Thornton returned to the bench at 9:30, his expression calm but resolute. Manning and Walsh had returned to their table, but Manning's confident swagger had been replaced by the hunched posture of someone who finally understood that consequences were real and imminent. "Have you reached a decision regarding the request for a different judge?" Judge Thornton asked. Walsh stood slowly. "Your Honor, after consulting with our client, we have decided to proceed with you presiding over this hearing. Officer Manning has complete confidence in your fairness and impartiality." It was a lie, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Manning had no confidence in anything at this point, and Walsh was simply choosing the least terrible of several bad options. But Judge Thornton accepted the statement with a slight nod. "Very well. Let the record reflect that the defendant has waived any objection to my continuing to preside over these proceedings despite the personal connection that has been disclosed." Judge Thornton paused, looking directly at Manning for the first time since revealing the connection between them. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of both judicial authority and paternal determination. "Officer Manning, I want to be absolutely clear about something. The fact that you arrested my son does not change the evidence in this case. It does not alter the complaints that have been filed against you or the pattern of behavior that has been documented over the course of your career. What it does is provide additional evidence that the complaints against you are accurate, that your misconduct is ongoing, and that you represent a clear and present danger to the civil rights of the citizens you are sworn to protect." Manning tried to meet Judge Thornton's gaze, but found himself looking down at the table, unable to maintain eye contact with the father of the young man he had victimized. "This hearing will proceed based on evidence and law," Judge Thornton continued. "You will receive the same fair treatment that you denied my son, the same due process that you have violated in the cases of countless other citizens. Justice, Officer Manning, is not about revenge. It is about ensuring that no one else suffers what you have inflicted on others." Judge Thornton picked up his gavel, the weight of it in his hand, carrying the promise of accountability that had been 17 years in the making. "Let's proceed with the evidence." Manning sat at the defendant's table, his career crumbling around him, his protection evaporating, his future uncertain. For the first time in 17 years, he was facing someone who couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bullied, couldn't be made to look away from his misconduct. He was facing a father's love, armed with judicial authority, and there was nowhere left to run. The first witness called to testify against Officer Jackson Manning was Maria Gonzalez, now 26 years old, a registered nurse who had spent 7 years carrying the memory of her encounter with a police officer who had seen her skin color before her humanity. She walked to the witness stand with quiet dignity, her nursing uniform replaced by a professional navy dress, her voice steady despite the weight of finally being heard after years of being dismissed. Judge Thornton administered the oath with the gravity of someone who understood that Maria's testimony represented more than just one woman's experience. It was the voice of every citizen who had been victimized by Manning's casual cruelty, every person whose complaint had been filed away and forgotten by a system more interested in protecting officers than protecting the people they were supposed to serve. "Miss Gonzalez," said Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Chen, a sharp woman in her 30s who had built her career prosecuting police misconduct, Please tell the court about your encounter with Officer Manning on the evening of June 15th, 7 years ago." Maria took a breath and began. Her voice was clear, professional, the voice of someone who had spent years in medical emergencies where precision and clarity could mean the difference between life and death. "I was walking home from my job at Metro Grocery on Elm Street. It was about 9:30 at night, and I had my work uniform on, my name tag, my backpack with my textbooks, because I was taking nursing classes at the community college." Judge Thornton watched Manning as Maria spoke. The officer was staring down at the table, his shoulders hunched, unable or unwilling to look at the woman he had humiliated 7 years earlier. The confident swagger that had carried him into the courtroom that morning had completely evaporated, replaced by the posture of someone who finally understood that consequences were real and unavoidable. "Officer Manning pulled up beside me in his patrol car," Maria continued. "He got out and asked me what I was doing in the neighborhood. I explained that I lived 3 blocks away, that I was walking home from work. He asked for my identification, which I provided. Then he asked to search my backpack." "Did you consent to the search?" ADHN asked. "I asked if I had to let him search it. He said I could refuse, but that refusing would make him suspicious. He said cooperative people don't have anything to hide." Judge Thornton made a note. Manning had used coercion disguised as choice, a common tactic among officers who understood that most citizens didn't know their rights or were too intimidated to assert them. "What was in your backpack?" "Textbooks for my anatomy and physiology class, my work uniform for the next day, a sandwich I had made for lunch but didn't eat, and my insulin pen. I'm diabetic." "Did Officer Manning treat you with respect during this encounter?" Maria's composure wavered slightly. 7 years of suppressed emotion threatening to break through her professional calm. "No, he dumped everything out of my backpack onto the sidewalk. My textbooks, my uniform, my food. He stepped on my anatomy textbook, left a boot print on the cover. When I bent down to pick up my insulin pen, he told me to keep my hands where he could see them." Judge Thornton watched Manning carefully. The officer's face had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists on the table before him. Either he was remembering the encounter and feeling shame, or he was angry at being held accountable for behavior he had never expected to face consequences for. "What happened next?" ADHN prompted. "He accused me of being in the neighborhood to buy drugs. I told him I lived there, showed him my lease agreement that I carried in my wallet. He said that paperwork could be faked, that drug dealers were getting smarter about creating false identities." "How did the encounter end?" "He shoved me against his patrol car when I tried to explain that I was a nursing student, that I had never used illegal drugs, that I was just trying to get home safely. He told me to shut up and show some respect. Then he got back in his car and drove away, leaving me to pick up my belongings from the sidewalk." ADHN let the testimony settle for a moment before continuing. "Ms. Gonzalez, did you file a complaint about this incident?" "Yes. I went to the police station the next day. I filled out all the paperwork, provided my contact information, gave them the names of witnesses who had seen what happened." "What was the result of your complaint?" Maria's voice tightened slightly. "I received a letter 3 weeks later saying that the investigation had found no evidence of misconduct. The case was closed." Judge Thornton felt a familiar anger building in his chest. Maria's complaint had been dismissed, despite her detailed account, despite witness statements, despite the clear violation of her civil rights. The system had protected Manning and abandoned Maria, sending the message that her dignity mattered less than an officer's comfort. Manning's attorney, Sandra Walsh, stood for cross-examination. Her strategy was limited. The facts of the encounter were not in dispute, and attacking Maria's credibility would only make Manning look worse. But she had to try something. "Ms. Gonzalez, you said this incident occurred 7 years ago. Are you certain about all the details you've testified to today?" Maria looked directly at Walsh, her expression calm but resolute. "Ma'am, I'm a trauma nurse. I've been trained to observe details, to remember critical information under stress, and some experiences, especially the ones where someone treats you like you're less than human, those you don't forget." Walsh had no follow-up questions. She sat down, recognizing that further questioning would only reinforce the power of Maria's testimony. The second witness was Robert Washington, the retired teacher who had been handcuffed in his own driveway 5 years earlier. At 72, he walked to the witness stand with the careful dignity of someone who had spent a lifetime teaching children to believe in justice, even when justice failed to believe in them. "Mr. Washington," ADHN began, "please tell the court about your encounter with Officer Manning." Robert's voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had spent 40 years explaining complex concepts to young minds. "I called the police because I heard breaking glass in my neighbor's yard. I was concerned that someone might be trying to break into their house while they were out of town." What happened when Officer Manning arrived? He immediately assumed that I was the person who had been breaking into the house. He didn't ask for my identification, didn't ask what I had seen or heard. He just ordered me to put my hands behind my back. Judge Thornton watched Manning, who was still staring down at the table, unable to meet the eyes of the man he had humiliated in front of an entire neighborhood. "Did you try to explain that you were the person who had called for help?" "I did. I told him I lived in the house, that I was the one who had called 911. He said he didn't care what I claimed, that he would decide who belonged where." The phrase echoed Luke's testimony from the previous evening. Manning had used almost identical language when arresting Luke, demonstrating a pattern of behavior that treated black men as suspects first and citizens second. What happened next? "He handcuffed me in my own driveway while my neighbors watched. Mrs. Patterson from next door tried to tell him that I lived there, that I was a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. He told her to mind her own business." Robert's voice tightened slightly. "Then he searched my house without a warrant, went through my belongings, my personal papers, my family photographs. When he found my teaching awards and retirement plaque, he said that didn't prove anything, that criminals could steal anything." Judge Thornton made another note: warrantless search of a home based on racial assumptions rather than evidence. Another clear constitutional violation that had been dismissed by the system supposed to provide accountability. How did the encounter end? He found evidence that the real burglar had broken into the garage behind my house. Broken glass, stolen tools, footprints that clearly didn't match mine. But he never apologized, never acknowledged that he had been wrong. He just uncuffed me and left. "Did you file a complaint?" "I did. My daughter helped me fill out the paperwork. We included statements from neighbors who had witnessed the entire incident." "What was the result?" Robert's shoulders sagged slightly. "Same as always. No evidence of misconduct. Case closed." Walsh's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. Robert's account was detailed, corroborated by witnesses, and documented by the police report that Manning himself had filed. There was no way to challenge the facts without making Manning look even worse. The third witness was Dr. Jennifer Williams, the social worker who had been handcuffed during a child welfare visit. She testified about Manning's immediate assumption that she was part of whatever problem he had been called to address. His refusal to acknowledge her professional credentials, his use of excessive force in front of traumatized children. "The children I was there to help watched me get arrested," Dr. Williams said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Kids who were already scared, already traumatized, saw a police officer treat the person who was supposed to protect them like a criminal. It destroyed months of work, destroyed the trust I had built with that family." The pattern was becoming undeniable. Manning didn't see individual people. He saw threats to be neutralized, problems to be solved through force and intimidation. His badge had become a weapon, his authority, a tool for inflicting his personal prejudices on anyone unlucky enough to encounter him. The fourth witness was David Rodriguez, whose arrest 3 weeks earlier had finally prompted this hearing. His testimony was similar to the others, a routine encounter escalated by Manning's racial assumptions, dignity violated in service of an officer's need for dominance, a complaint filed and dismissed by a system more interested in protecting officers than protecting citizens. By the time the fourth witness finished testifying, Manning's defense was in shambles. Walsh had been unable to challenge any of the factual accounts, unable to explain away the pattern of behavior, unable to argue that 4 separate incidents spanning 7 years were somehow justified or coincidental. Judge Thornton called a brief recess before the prosecution's final witness. Manning sat at the defendant's table, his career in ruins around him, his protection evaporated, his future hanging by the thread of a decision that everyone in the courtroom already knew was inevitable. When court reconvened, ADA Chen called Luke Thornton to the witness stand. Luke walked forward with the same quiet dignity he had shown during his arrest, wearing the same navy blue suit that had been wrinkled by Manning's handcuffs. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Thornton's son raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Manning finally looked up from the table, his eyes meeting Luke's for the first time since the arrest. In that moment, Manning saw not just another young black man to be processed through his system of casual cruelty, but a human being whose life he had tried to diminish, whose dignity he had attempted to destroy, whose future he had threatened with the weight of an unjust system. Luke's testimony was precise, detailed, and devastating. He described Manning's approach, the immediate assumption of guilt, the escalation of a peaceful encounter into a public humiliation. His account matched the security footage that had been playing on news broadcasts for 24 hours, corroborated the witness statements that had been flooding into the prosecutor's office. Officer Manning told me that maybe a night in lockup would teach me some respect, Luke testified. He said this loud enough for everyone watching to hear. It wasn't about law enforcement, it was about humiliation, about putting me in what he considered my place. Walsh's cross-examination was perfunctory and pointless. Luke's account was documented by video evidence, corroborated by multiple witnesses, and part of a pattern that had been established by the previous testimony. There was nothing to challenge, nothing to dispute, nothing to argue, except the meaning of behavior that spoke for itself. When Luke stepped down from the witness stand, Manning's fate was sealed. The prosecution had presented overwhelming evidence of a pattern of racial profiling, abuse of authority, and civil rights violations spanning 17 years. The defense had offered nothing except procedural objections and character witnesses who testified to Manning's reputation among fellow officers who shared his prejudices. Judge Thornton called for closing arguments, though everyone in the courtroom understood that the outcome was no longer in doubt. Justice had finally caught up with Jackson Manning, and no amount of police union protection or institutional cover-up could save him from the consequences of his own actions. The truth was in the balance, and for the first time in 17 years, the truth was heavier than Manning's badge. Judge William Thornton sat in his chambers for 30 minutes after closing arguments concluded, not because he needed time to deliberate. The evidence had been overwhelming, the pattern undeniable, the verdict clear from the moment the first witness had spoken, but because he understood that the decision he was about to render would echo far beyond this courtroom, far beyond Jackson Manning's career, far beyond even his own family's experience with police misconduct. The ruling he was preparing to deliver would send a message to every officer who had forgotten that their badge was meant to protect rather than terrorize, to every supervisor who had chosen to protect predators rather than citizens, to every victim who had been told their pain didn't matter because it conflicted with institutional comfort. This moment was about more than Manning. It was about the soul of a system that had lost its way and needed to find its conscience again. Judge Thornton had spent these 30 minutes reviewing not just the evidence from the hearing, but the broader implications of what Manning's case represented. The officer's 17-year career of misconduct wasn't an aberration. It was a symptom of institutional failure, of a system that had consistently chosen the comfort of bad officers over the safety of good citizens. The complaints against Manning told a story that extended far beyond individual incidents. They revealed a department culture that protected predators, supervisors who preferred convenient lies to uncomfortable truths, and a bureaucratic system that had learned to process citizen complaints like unwanted paperwork, filed away, forgotten, and ultimately meaningless. But today would be different. Today, the system would remember its purpose. Judge Thornton had also spent these minutes thinking about his son, about Luke's dignity in the face of Manning's cruelty, about the young man's concern for other victims, even after being victimized himself. Luke had been raised to believe in justice, and Manning's arrest had tested that faith in the most personal way possible. The ruling Judge Thornton was about to deliver would either validate that faith or confirm Luke's worst fears about the system his father served. The weight of that responsibility was immense. Judge Thornton wasn't just deciding Manning's fate, he was determining whether a young black man who had dedicated his life to pursuing justice would continue to believe that justice was possible. Finally, Judge Thornton had used these minutes to consider the victims who had found the courage to testify against Manning. Maria Gonzalez, who had been a 19-year-old nursing student when Manning first victimized her, had spent 7 years carrying the memory of that humiliation. Robert Washington, who had called police for help and received harassment instead, had watched his faith in law enforcement die in his own driveway. Dr. Jennifer Williams had seen her professional work destroyed by an officer who cared more about his prejudices than the welfare of vulnerable children. These people had trusted the system once and been betrayed. They had filed complaints and been ignored. They had sought justice and been told their pain didn't matter. Today, Judge Thornton would prove to them that their courage in speaking truth to power had not been wasted. Judge Thornton returned to the bench at 4 o'clock, his black robes carrying the weight of both judicial authority and moral certainty. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. The media presence was overwhelming. Local news crews, national reporters, civil rights organizations, and community leaders who understood they were witnessing a potential turning point in the struggle for police accountability. Manning sat at the defendant's table with the posture of a man who already knew his fate. His confident swagger had been replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone who finally understood that consequences were real, that protection had limits, that badges couldn't shield him from the weight of his own actions. His attorney, Sandra Walsh, sat beside him with the resigned expression of someone who had run out of legal strategies and was simply waiting for the inevitable. Luke Thornton was in the gallery, sitting with the quiet dignity that Manning had tried to crush on the courthouse steps, but had only managed to reveal in its full strength. Beside him sat the other witnesses who had testified: Maria Gonzalez, Robert Washington, Dr. Jennifer Williams, David Rodriguez, people whose courage in speaking truth to power had finally given voice to 17 years of accumulated pain. The presence of these witnesses in the courtroom was significant beyond their individual testimonies. For years, Manning's victims had been isolated, told their experiences were unique, their complaints unsubstantiated, their pain irrelevant. Seeing each other, hearing each other's stories, recognizing the pattern of abuse they had all endured, it had transformed them from individual victims into a collective voice for accountability. Maria Gonzalez had told reporters during the lunch break that hearing the other testimonies had been both heartbreaking and healing. "I thought I was alone," she had said. "I thought maybe I had done something wrong. Maybe I had somehow deserved the way he treated me. But hearing the others, seeing the pattern, it wasn't about us, it was about him." Robert Washington had expressed similar sentiments. "For 5 years, I've been telling myself that maybe I misunderstood what happened. Maybe the officer was just having a bad day. But this hearing has shown me that it wasn't a bad day. It was a bad officer who should never have been allowed to keep hurting people." Judge Thornton looked across the courtroom, his eyes moving from Manning to the victims, from the media to the community leaders, from his son to the citizens who had come to witness whether justice would finally be served or whether the system would once again choose protection over accountability. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had never confused mercy with weakness, who understood that true compassion sometimes required the courage to inflict necessary pain. "Officer Manning," Judge Thornton began, "stand and face this court." Manning rose slowly, his legs unsteady, his hands trembling slightly. For 17 years, he had stood in courtrooms as the representative of law and order, the symbol of authority and justice. Now he stood as the defendant, stripped of protection, facing the judgment that his victims had been denied for far too long. The evidence presented in this hearing has revealed a pattern of conduct that is not merely inappropriate, it is criminal. Over the course of 17 years, you have systematically violated the civil rights of citizens whose only crime was existing while black in spaces where you felt they didn't belong. Judge Thornton's voice was measured, precise, each word chosen for maximum impact. and minimal ambiguity. The testimony we have heard describes not isolated incidents or split-second decisions made under pressure, but a deliberate, sustained campaign of racial profiling and abuse of authority. You have used your badge as a weapon, your uniform as a costume for cruelty, your position of trust as an opportunity to inflict harm on people you were sworn to protect. Manning's face had gone ashen. The words were hitting him like physical blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of the protection that had shielded him for so long. Maria Gonzalez was a 19-year-old nursing student walking home from work when you decided that her skin color made her suspicious. You violated her dignity, destroyed her property, and dismissed her humanity because it conflicted with your prejudices. Judge Thornton paused, letting the weight of Manning's actions settle over the courtroom like smoke. Robert Washington was a 70-year-old retired teacher who called police for help and received humiliation instead. You handcuffed him in his own driveway, searched his home without warrant, and treated a man who had spent 40 years educating children like a common criminal. The judge's voice hardened slightly, the controlled fury of someone who had seen too much injustice and finally had the power to address it. Dr. Jennifer Williams was a licensed social worker performing her professional duties when you decided that her credentials mattered less than your assumptions. You traumatized children who were already vulnerable, destroyed months of therapeutic work, and demonstrated that your badge was more important to you than the welfare of the people you claimed to serve. Manning was swaying slightly, the full weight of his actions finally settling on him after 17 years of believing they didn't matter. David Rodriguez was a father of 3, driving carefully through his own neighborhood when you decided that his existence required investigation. You arrested him for no reason except that he challenged your authority to victimize him without cause. Judge Thornton's eyes found Luke in the gallery, and for just a moment, the judicial mask slipped to reveal the pain of a father whose son had been targeted by the same predator who had victimized so many others. And yesterday you arrested my son on the steps of this courthouse, the very building dedicated to justice, because he was young, black, and successful in a space where you felt he didn't belong. You demonstrated that 17 years of complaints, 17 years of warnings, 17 years of opportunities for redemption had taught you nothing except that the system would protect you no matter how egregious your behavior became. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the reporters had stopped taking notes, transfixed by the controlled fury of a judge who was finally holding accountable an officer who had escaped consequences for far too long. Luke felt the weight of his father's words, understanding that this moment was about more than family vindication. It was about every victim who had been dismissed, every complaint that had been ignored, every person who had been told their pain didn't matter because it conflicted with institutional comfort. My son is a law school graduate, a young man who has dedicated his life to serving others, someone who represents the best of what this community can produce. You saw those qualities and decided they were threatening, that an educated black man must be lying about his legitimate purpose. Your actions revealed the true nature of your 17-year career, not law enforcement, but legalized harassment of people whose success challenged your prejudices. Judge Thornton picked up Manning's personnel file, the thick folder that documented 17 years of misconduct, abuse, and institutional protection. The weight of it in his hands represented not just one officer's crimes, but a system's failure to protect the people it was supposed to serve. Officer Manning, you have argued through your attorney that these incidents were within departmental guidelines, that your actions were justified by officer safety concerns, that the complaints against you were exaggerated or misunderstood. The evidence does not support any of these claims. Judge Thornton picked up Manning's personnel file, the thick folder that documented 17 years of misconduct, abuse, and institutional protection. What this file reveals is not a dedicated officer making difficult decisions under pressure, but a predator in uniform who learned that his badge gave him license to inflict his personal prejudices on anyone unlucky enough to encounter him. The system that should have stopped you instead enabled you, sending the message that your victim's pain mattered less than your comfort. Manning was openly trembling now, his hands clenched into fists, his breathing shallow and rapid. The protection he had relied on for 17 years was gone. The consequences he had never faced were finally arriving, and the badge that had given him power was about to become evidence of his unfitness to serve. The court finds you guilty of multiple violations of civil rights under color of law, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of your oath to serve and protect. These are not administrative violations. They are crimes that have caused immeasurable harm to individuals, families, and the community's trust in law enforcement. Judge Thornton reached for his gavel, the weight of it in his hand, carrying the promise of justice that had been 17 years in the making. Officer Manning, you are hereby terminated from the police force immediately. Your badge, your gun, and your authority are revoked permanently. You are barred from any future employment in law enforcement at any level, in any jurisdiction. The gavel came down with the sound of finality, echoing through the courtroom like thunder after lightning. But Judge Thornton wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court is recommending that the FBI investigate your pattern of civil rights violations for potential federal charges. The evidence presented here suggests that your misconduct rises to the level of criminal behavior that warrants prosecution under federal civil rights statutes. Manning's legs gave out, and he collapsed into his chair, his career destroyed, his protection evaporated, his future uncertain. The badge that had defined him for 17 years was gone, taken away by the father of a young man he had tried to humiliate, but had only succeeded in revealing as someone whose dignity could not be diminished by casual cruelty. To the victims who testified here today, Judge Thornton continued, his voice softening slightly, I apologize on behalf of a system that failed you. Your courage in speaking truth to power has finally given voice to years of accumulated pain. Your dignity was never negotiable, despite what Officer Manning's actions suggested. Judge Thornton's eyes found Luke again, and the pride in his gaze was visible, even through his judicial composure. Justice is not about revenge. It is about ensuring that no one else suffers what you have suffered, that no other family endures what Manning has inflicted, that no other officer believes their badge gives them license to terrorize the people they are sworn to protect. The judge stood, his robes flowing behind him like storm clouds after the lightning has passed. This hearing is concluded. Officer Manning, you have 30 minutes to surrender your badge and weapon to court security. The record will reflect that justice has been served, accountability has been demanded, and the system has finally remembered what it was supposed to protect. The courtroom erupted in applause, not the polite acknowledgement typically heard in legal proceedings, but the deep, sustained applause of people who had finally seen justice served after years of watching predators escape consequences. Community leaders were embracing, civil rights advocates were wiping away tears, and victims were experiencing the validation that had been denied them for so long. Manning sat at the defendant's table, his world collapsed around him, his protection gone, his future uncertain. Walsh was already gathering her papers, preparing to distance herself and the police union from a client who had become a liability too great to defend. The bailiff approached Manning with a property envelope, waiting for the former officer to surrender the badge and weapon that had defined his identity for 17 years. Manning's hands shook as he unpinned the badge from his uniform, the metal feeling heavier than it ever had before. Luke Thornton made his way through the crowd to the front of the courtroom, where Judge Thornton was speaking quietly with court officers. Father and son looked at each other across the space that separated the bench from the gallery. And in that moment, the formal distance between judge and citizen dissolved into something more fundamental. The bond between a father who had delivered justice and a son who had inspired it. Dad, Luke said quietly when they were finally alone in chambers, thank you. Judge Thornton embraced his son, the weight of the day's events finally settling on him. Thank you for having the courage to trust the system even after it failed you. Your dignity in the face of Manning's cruelty reminded me why I became a judge in the first place. Outside the courthouse, the media was already reporting the story that would become national news: a police officer terminated and recommended for federal prosecution after arresting a judge's son, a system finally holding accountable someone it had protected for too long, a father's love armed with judicial authority, delivering justice that had been 17 years in the making. Manning's termination sent shockwaves through the police department. Officers who had operated with similar impunity suddenly found themselves reviewing their own conduct, wondering if their protection was as absolute as they had believed. Supervisors who had dismissed complaints without investigation discovered their commitment to accountability. Politicians who had enabled misconduct found their concern for civil rights. The victims who had testified found themselves finally believed, finally validated, finally able to trust that their pain had mattered. Maria Gonzalez received calls from nursing programs offering scholarships. Robert Washington was invited to speak at community meetings about police reform. Dr. Jennifer Williams was recognized by her professional organization for her courage in speaking truth to power. David Rodriguez became an advocate for police accountability. 6 months later, the FBI filed federal civil rights charges against Manning. He was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, becoming a symbol of what happened when predators in uniform finally faced consequences for their actions. The police department implemented new training protocols, new oversight mechanisms, new accountability measures designed to prevent another Manning from terrorizing citizens under color of law. Community trust slowly began to rebuild. Relationships between police and citizens slowly began to heal, and the badge slowly began to regain its meaning as a symbol of protection rather than oppression. Luke Thornton was hired by the Public Defender's Office, where he specialized in representing victims of police misconduct. His first case involved a young black woman who had been arrested for the crime of existing while educated in a space where an officer felt she didn't belong. Luke won the case, secured a settlement that changed the woman's life, and sent another message that victims would no longer be ignored. Judge William Thornton continued to serve on the bench with the same fairness and integrity that had characterized his career, but with a deeper understanding of how personal experience could inform judicial wisdom without compromising judicial neutrality. He became known as a judge who understood that justice required not just legal knowledge, but moral courage, the courage to hold accountable those who abused power, the courage to protect those who had been abandoned by the system, the courage to ensure that badges served justice rather than commanding it. The Manning case became a teaching tool in law schools, police academies, and judicial training programs across the country. It demonstrated that accountability was possible when good people had the courage to demand it, that protection for bad actors was not absolute, and that justice could prevail when the system remembered its true purpose. Years later, when Luke Thornton was asked about the day that changed his life, he would say that Manning's arrest had been traumatic, but ultimately transformative. It showed me that the system I believed in was flawed, he would reflect. But it also showed me that those flaws could be corrected when people of conscience refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Judge Thornton would remember the case as the most important decision of his judicial career, not because it involved his family, but because it demonstrated that justice could transcend personal interest, that accountability could overcome institutional protection, and that the law could indeed protect the innocent when it was wielded by people who understood its true purpose. If you're moved by stories that spark change and call for justice, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more powerful tales of truth and transformation coming your way, because sometimes it takes one person's fall to lift up an entire system of justice. Thank you for following this story to its conclusion. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that stories of accountability continue to be told when they matter most.